So at the moment, it is a standalone 2D executable separate from the client. Just because that's the easiest thing to work with from the beginning. I have been talking to another developer about potentially, who's also working on his own game engine and potentially merging some of our code and then working together into the future.
Welcome to Metaverse Degen. I'm Lion. Raptor's not with us today, he's working, but we are here joined by our fantastic guest. Who are you?
Hello. I guess I'm WireWhiz. I'm working on Brane Engine, which is an open source full framework for building multiplayer VR worlds, or at least that's what it's going to be when it's finished. I kind of have a world here, which is a little bit of like a mental like manifestation of what I kind of imagine it being like when it's done. It obviously it's like very much like an abstract, like, oh look, there's like a tree of worlds upon like a like tangle of different threads and flows of data. But this is where we hold like meetups, and I've started streaming from this world as well.
Oh, wow.
So yeah.
Wow. So, may I ask what got you started this project and got you into VR? And yeah, I'll start with that. I'm very curious myself.
I've just kind of I like working on hard problems. Like I've been coding for as long as I can remember. I think I started with like I'll just put my controllers down. Started with like websites when I was like 7 or 8. And then like only really like fully got into it in my teens. Gonna lock my movement here. There we go. And I got into VR just because it seemed cool. I picked up a Google Cardboard, and I started making like WebXR stuff for it. And eventually that evolved into getting a Windows mixed reality headset, and then a Vive, and I really just enjoyed figuring out how to do stuff on the headset. I had a website, WireWhiz.com, which I originally posted like electrical tutorials, like how to use like transistors, resistors, all that sort of stuff. Very simple. It didn't get above like literally that level of like basic components. Since I was kind of trying to teach myself how to do it by doing those tutorials. But then like after kind of like my 3D printing phase, which kind of coincided with the VR phase. But after all of that, I kind of found that I like software more, so I got into that. Um, and a lot of what I learned of VR was like through making stuff for it. So like I was posting tutorials on how to do VR stuff on that website before I even knew what Unity was. Like I would learned coding through like Khan Academy and stuff. So I started out with like WebXR stuff. And then transitioned into Unity when I realized how much better working in an actual game engine is, when there's actually like tools and frameworks to help you get to your projects to where you want to be. Um, so yeah, then like from my website, a company where the if you've been in the VR space for long enough, you'll know who they are. The Decagear hired me because they found my website, and I made a fair number of like Unity demos for them. Most that didn't see the light of day, but like the famous one of like Kelly walking around like the sci-fi garage with the face tracking. That was one that I did a lot of the actual interactivity on.
Wow.
And then after my time at Decagear, I worked at Wonderland Engine, which is a another WebXR engine. So it's a very like Unity like interface, and then you build out what you build in there to a directory you can host on the web anywhere. It's like a static directory, and um, yeah, it's full game engine but for WebXR. And then from there, I worked at CyberHub. We were working on a like multiplayer framework. The idea is that you'd be able to drop a the package or library into a project or framework, and then have like essentially just all space and then be able to build from there. It was a more kind of slightly more towards corporations sort of thing. And then I recently left there to come work on this, which I've been working on at least the ideas of this since my time at like Decagear. So this is a like 3 to 4 year long project so far, at least from like ideas. I haven't gone like a day without thinking about it, even if there have been like months of time where I have taken breaks from it.
Wow. So I'm gonna ask a couple questions, at least to clarify for some things, as I may not know, and those watching may not know. What is WebXR, and how is what you were doing in the early stages with WebXR different from those who'd be familiar with the Unity and stuff here in VRChat?
Well, I guess the easiest answer to that is WebXR is VR or AR inside of a traditional web browser. So a lot of like computer web browsers have very early support for like well, not early, I would say more locked down. I guess it would be decently mature at this point. But you're able to connect like your PC VR headset to your computer, navigate to a web page, and there will be like a little VR icon in the corner. Click that, and it pops up in your headset. Or if you're on a phone, like back in the Google Cardboard days, it was a lot more common to do it on your phone, and you'd have like a holder you put your phone into, navigate to the website, click the VR button, and now you're in VR. So anytime you see VR in a web browser, that's WebXR. And that's different to Unity because in Unity or any other traditional game engine that you would use to make a VR application, because the compiled nature of those applications allows them to be a lot faster, a lot more performant. Since browsers are very sandboxed environment, the browsers are a little bit of a mud ball where they've just added on new technologies one after another, and it's with differing levels of cohesion. So the main priority of a web browser is just to work and not let the user be hacked. Whereas a game engine is more focused on let's give this person as many frames as possible and also make it look nice within those budgets. Um, and then the project that I'm working on now, which is Brane Engine, is trying to bridge the gap between those two, where let's try to get away from the mud ball aspect of the browser, where like none of these technologies are super cohesive, and it's hard to achieve like high performance and also like fully interactive worlds that would be possible in regular game engines. Let's try making an engine from the ground up to have a cohesive amount of like having let everything work together and with a focus on performance, but also ease of use because the browser also suffers from a lot of it's a bad developer experience. Like it's hard to debug what's going on there in a lot of different ways for a lot of different reasons, especially when you get into the areas where you do start like trying to optimize for the browser because there's a thing called WebAssembly, which allows you to compile many different languages down to a smaller version of assembly language, which is usually the last layer before um, compiling down to the language that computers are actually able to understand, machine language. And this is like the browser's version of it. So it's a lot easier to JIT compile, which is just-in-time compile, which means instead of compiling it on the developer's machine, it compiles it on the user's machine. And that runs a lot faster. The problem is when you do that in the context of a web browser, it gets even harder to debug. Whereas with what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to make it easily debuggable, but also easily buildable in the first place. So the best of both worlds. There's a lot of having my cake and eating it too in what I'm trying to build.
So would it work in both browser and on a VR headset traditionally? And how do you plan on bridging the two different XR style and game engines?
So that's one of the things is no, it would not work on the web browser. Otherwise, I would just make a WebXR engine because it's a lot easier to go from web to a standalone application than it is to go from a standalone application to the web. So the way that the Brane engine is architected, or the Brane, or whatever you want to call the tech stack, is everybody would be expected to use a common client, which would essentially be the Brane's version of a web browser. And then that client is what you would use to go to different worlds. And the way you would go to those is you'd either type directly in like an IP address or a regular domain name, and then you would connect to servers, which are also part of the Brane project, and then that would stream all the assets. And I don't define assets as just anything required to run the game. So that's materials, textures, scripts, all the things you're used to. If you've ever built anything for Vrchat, you'll know what those things are. Um, it would stream all those things down to the user in real time, and the client would be the optimized uh, browser of sorts for browsing the world. So instead of a web browser, it's like a world browser. And also, another part of the Brane project is the editor tools to actually build those assets in a optimized and hopefully easy way.
Okay. So would it be more like a more immersive version of a web browser then kind of thing? Kind of mixture both a social platform and a browser?
Uh, Less a social platform. It would allow for the creation of social platforms, but it would essentially act like a imagine like VRChat or Resonite or any number of these social VR platforms, but where the users are able to host their own servers, and the focus is on like VR first, and all the features that are required for that. Um, but it was kind of the idea that inspired the engine, or at least one of the ideas, is that um, like I had been working on the project before Facebook renamed itself to Meta. But when they did, I was like, who's going to own like the metaverse? Because at the end of the day, it really shouldn't be owned by anybody. It should be a collaborative effort between everybody who's built on top of it. And ideally, for that, you'd have a like the most ideal world is you'd have a set of efficient standards agreed upon by everybody. The problem with that is that standards are often very, very slow to develop, and oftentimes they have to only come out after a solution has already been in existence for a while. So, in the example of GLTF, for instance, GLTF is a very common file type for scenes and meshes and models. It's expanded to have a number of capabilities beyond that, but essentially, if you have like a 3D asset that you want to move somewhere, it's a pretty good guess that GLTF will be able to support that. But GLTF only was able to be created after we've had like a myriad of other 3D asset types, and we're very sure what we need this to be able to do. Um, Similarly, I think that there's going to be proprietary and non-standard platforms that come out first that will support the vision of a metaverse, and eventually they will grow into being either the standard themselves, in the case of open source platforms, or inspiration will be taken from them to create that eventual standard. So this is kind of my take at like trying to build something like that, not too much worrying about making it a standard per se, but kind of trying to show or trailblaze in a sense towards that eventual goal.
Okay. So another question I have in my head is the way you said servers will be within inside this brand project, would they be more akin to like a VRChat world or instance, or more akin to like a Minecraft server or like Second Life's islands, how they do things?
So the way that I do servers is a little bit abstract. There's the way I like explaining is there's two different server types. One of which is an asset server, and the other is a multiplayer or runtime server. And the idea is that an asset server stores all of the things that you've created. So this stores all the information about your world and how it should be displayed. And the other type of server, and you can have multiple of these, or runtime servers. So each runtime server would be the equivalent of like a VRChat instance.
Mm.
So this one stores your world, this one stores your or runs your instances. And then what would the shape of those worlds be? You mentioned like the islands of Second Life
Mm.
or VRChat instances. The way that worlds manifest or will manifest in Brane is very modular. So instead of a scene like traditional game engines use, I want to try to do something different, which is have portions of worlds defined inside chunks. So these chunks would be just regions with an arbitrary or like self-defined border, and then these chunks would be able to be placed next to each other. So instead of there being like a world origin 00, it would be I have this chunk and it has this offset from this chunk, which has a this offset from this chunk. So you kind of create like you can create a grid. It doesn't necessarily have to be a grid. It can be like different sized pieces. But you can create a grid of pieces of a world to kind of form what you want that to look like. And the idea is as you would move from one chunk to another, the chunks that you move further away from would unload, and the chunks you're moving closer to would load in. So it's very much a you could build any size world with that as long as you had the server space to actually store it. And
Oh, wow.
then the way that runtime servers work would be that you're able to the client would be able to connect to as many runtime servers and asset servers as they need to at once. So there's nothing saying that this chunk right here isn't able to connect to a chunk hosted on a different server. So I was actually talking to some friends recently, and they brought up that they each one of them have photo scanned, like a lot of them have photo scanned their rooms or like bedrooms, and they would like to do a I think they might have already done this, but an idea they had is they'd want to like put all their rooms next to each other inside of like a shared greater world. Like you would have a hallway between all of
Mm.
them, but they all still want to be the one like owning their room, their portion of the world. And with like this chunk system, it would be possible to say like, here's the hallway, my room is at this offset to that hallway, and then everybody else would be able to do the same and link all of those individually hosted and owned things together. And the engine, the backend bone, would just handle all of the actual logic for that, and all they would have to say is, "This is the way I want it to be."
Oh, wow. So would it stay active as long as people are in it, or once people leave, it'll no longer be active?
So that's I'm guessing what you're asking about is persistence.
Yeah.
I would leave that up to the actual world to decide, since the asset server component of it, I do plan for that to be able to be also where you store data about the world. So anything like if you want to store leaderboards or more specific data like positions of objects in the world, there will just be a generic database API on there, where you can just script however you want your data to interact with that. The runtime servers, on the other hand, if you're hosting your own, those would be what's actively like sending you this player's position is here and this player's position is here, and I'm telling the runtime server my position's here. Those are the servers actually in charge of that, and those would get spun up and spun down depending on how active the worlds are. Whereas the asset server would kind of just always sit there. It always needs to be ready for when somebody asks information about the world. Um, of course, it'd be up to individual creators how they want to handle the spinning up and spinning down of their servers. I'll probably have to come up with abstractions for common hosting platforms, but that's something that I haven't thought about too much. What would be cool is like if multiple groups would want to pool those servers together, which is something I've lightly thought about, but not actually made any plans or wrote any spec about.
Cool. From the sounds of everything you said so far, it sounds like you're putting in a lot of work to this. How much work were you expecting when getting into it, and how much does have you written so far to coach this kind of stuff?
I expected it to be a lot of work. Like, when you say I want to build a game engine, everybody says, oh, that's going to be a lot of work. But I'm not just building a game engine, I'm also building like backend servers. And it's a lot more complicated than like I just need a 3D game that works well and is single player. It's like this whole expansive thing. So I honestly haven't thought about the total amount of work because I don't think I physically can.
Oh,
Um,
I'm
I'm
sure.
just kind of like I'll just plan for this to take like 5 to 10 years, and that's probably a decent estimate.
Oh, so how much code and server information does it take to run something like those you have so far? Is anything usable, or is it still in the development process?
Very, very much in the development process. Right now, like the latest working demo I have is I have a standalone editor binary, and you're able to load a model into that editor, and you're able to assign a material, write fully custom shaders. That is one part that is fleshed out. And then you're able to connect that editor to an asset server, upload that asset, which is just one static mesh, and then you can have a client binary, and that client binary you can tell it, hey, connect to this server and download this specific chunk in like a config file, and then when that client boots up, it'll try to connect to the asset server and download that asset down. And it's like pretty cool. I can do insert a line of code into the asset streaming script to slow it down a lot, and then you'll be able to see like individual triangles on the model load in, um, like one by one, because that is one thing that I'm trying to do is make everything as modular as possible. So instead of like waiting in the void um, while an entire world loads in, instead you'd be able to get into a world when you've loaded the minimum amount of content for it to function, then you'd see the rest of the world load out around you. Um, but at the moment, that's all I have right now is editor, upload one thing, and then download one thing. It's not even in VR. And I don't think I even put any interactivity into the client. Even though it would be relatively easy to add like a camera view pan, I haven't done that yet. Most of my focus has been on the underlying architecture of the engine, as well as writing a custom scripting language, which the scripting language has honestly taken the most time because the last time I was working on the engine a ton, I had put like 8 months into that, and now that I've picked up the engine again, that has also taken the majority of the time that I've been working on the engine. Aside from very recently, I've been putting a lot of work into refactoring how assets actually function in the editor so that it's a lot more defined than it has been in the past. So just generally a lot of boilerplate plumbing stuff going on right now to actually support everything happening in the future. Basically, it looks like nothing's going on at all, and then suddenly it will look like a lot is going on.
Okay. So how similar is the brain to what people would assume other game engines would be like Unity, for example? How similar or different are they, and how does it like function and work?
Um, the way that I have the editor laid out is that it's supposed to be like you open it up and you can immediately tell that I've taken a lot of inspiration from Unity from the UI layout. Obviously, my like largest group of people that I would want using the engine, at least at first, is the people who have already been creating content for digital spaces, mainly Vrchat, because there's a ton of really creative people here.
Hmm.
Um, so I want to make a tool set that is at least comfortable for them, with only like uh, there are certain parts of the engine that will be unavoidably different from Unity,
Hmm.
like the scripting language. I can't just do C sharp with the way I want to do things, but I can make the language I'm writing like semi similar to C sharp, even if there's like some fundamental differences, for instance. Um, but yeah,
Oh,
um,
okay. So how similar is the language you're writing for the brain mask to C sharp? What and what are the differences as well?
So the biggest difference is trying really hard to make the brain multi-threaded by default, and what that means is the scripting language itself is uh, thought out in such a way where all of the operations on it can be done asynchronously, and that means having multiple things happening at once if those operations can be done in parallel. So what that looks like is instead of functions, which still technically kind of exist in the language, everything is split up into pipelines, where you have sections of code that happens non-asynchronously, like a standard function, and then you have blocks or breaks in the pipeline, where in those breaks you can say, hey, while I'm waiting, get me these assets and also release these bits of data here,
Hmm.
which is usually the hardest portion of asynchronous coding. But instead, it's like part of the syntax of Brane script to be able to manage those things. And then after that break, you're then able to go on to regular coding again. So it's kind of like this, almost more like a function is broken up into blocks rather than being like one function, and it's very much more about like how the data flows rather than here we're going to jump out, this function is going to handle something for me, and then we're going to jump back to the same point. Instead, it's here's an event, and then here's a pipeline that goes off and does its own thing, and then maybe this point can wait for the result of that pipeline, but hopefully it does some other stuff at the same time. So it's very much an abstraction of if you're very familiar with asynchronous programming in other languages, is like an abstraction of a promise or future in other languages, but from the syntactic, but hopefully from the syntactic level or like the syntax of the language, it's easier for people newer to the concepts, easier to understand, and honestly easier for veterans as well.
Hmm. Okay. So another bit of a question I have with that as well is, would it be through lines of code or nodes would it work? Or maybe both?
So hopefully, eventually, both. I'm trying to write the syntax of the language in such a way where eventually the text-based representation of the language, which is what I call the ground truth. Like the compiler always uses the text version of it to start the compiler process. But eventually, something that I would very much like to support is the ability for a UI environment to read the text-based version of that language and then create a node representation of that. Because since it is very much a has a focus on multi-threading, there's a lot of concepts in multi-threading that I think are displayed better visually than they are through text.
Hmm.
Like it's a lot harder to say like this thing relies on this thing and this thing also needs to wait for this thing and this thing is dependent upon these two things and this thing triggers that thing, but it's all like done through names and tags. Um, that's a lot harder to represent in text, but then if you put that into graphical representation, it's like here's a node and here's the lines coming off of this node representing what relies on what, and you can naturally see the flow of execution through that. And that's so I can imagine in the future having a editor environment where you have even in VR like a 3D representation of nodes, and that's how you define like the larger architecture of how a script works. Like I want this script to be triggered after this event, and I want these other scripts to wait on the completion of this script before they also run. And that'd be very easy and intuitive to do in a visual sense. Whereas in, say, Unity's ECS system, you have to like put tags at the top of the script, and that's very easy to mess up if you don't know what you're doing. And if you do know what you're doing, like if you're not paying full attention and you're like on autopilot, it's really easy to accidentally get that wrong. Whereas a visual representation just bloop, bloop, and then you're good to go.
Okay.
Of course, that's like that's a in the future thing. I need to get like the text-based version of it working first.
Oh, of course. I wouldn't expect that to be done anytime soon. You did say earlier you wish to have creators from like VR chat. as an example, or other platforms that are currently building to be the ones do it, would the assets and stuff they've created so far be easily convertible? You hope in the future, or would they have to like rebuild things and go into your engine that way?
So, in its current state, yes, there would be a lot of rebuilding. Things like meshes could probably be used out of the box, and shaders as well probably wouldn't take too much effort to bring over, since I still am using um, uh, a regular shading. I didn't rewrite shaders. I am rewriting like CPU-based programming. There's a potential that I could make BrainScript compile to shader code, but that's something that I've only very loosely considered. Um, on the topic of like larger assets, like a conversion tool where you just click convert and then like it goes through your Vrchat Unity project and exports that to something that the brain could use. That is something that I would like to look into, but haven't too much at this point. What I imagine that looking like is having a set of assets hosted somewhere on like my company's servers, where it's like here are the brain assets that match up to the VR chat concepts. Like here's a Fizzbone script, so I could, since my engine supports like fully custom scripting or will support fully custom scripting, it would be possible to create a script that is, here's the script that maps one to one with this VR chat thing, or very closely. And it would be possible to then create a Unity utility that goes through your entire project and then maps it to those brain concepts and creates a clone project. I'm saying it's possible. I haven't actually tried it, so maybe there would be some huge blockers. I can see automatic conversion of shaders being pretty hard unless I right now, my engine just uses GLSL since that's the easiest thing to do with a custom engine. I don't know. I don't think it would be too hard to also get HLSL working, which is what Unity is currently using. Um, as long as it compiles out to SBRV, which is what Vulkan expects, then it's like not out of the question. It would just have to be a matter of it would just be a matter of figuring out how to automatically convert Unity like concepts in shaders over to Brane's shader concepts.
Oh, so once, let's say someone comes over, wants to start building something in Brain, once it's fully functional, what would the editor be like? Would it be in headset? Would it be Unity style where you have a scene and then you work in a program and then upload that way? How would you imagine that would be working?
So at the moment, it is a standalone 2D executable separate from the client. Just because that's the easiest thing to work with from the beginning. I have been talking to another developer about potentially who is also working on his own game engine and potentially merging some of our code and then working together into the future. And the kind of layout of what that combined engine would look like, which still would be called Brane, like it still would be Brane engine, but he's a lot more like graphics focused. The If we did go that route, we probably would trend more towards the editor being an add-on addition to the client, in which case there would be a lot more emphasis put on like runtime reloading, editing within the actual world and application itself, and then you would have VR native editing happening from the beginning. And it is something I would like to experiment with in the future, even if I don't go that route. So right now, no VR, very much a Unity 2D like interface. Potentially in the future might switch directions to be much closer to a Resonite-esque experience.
Okay. Oh, well, thank you for explaining all that. I only ask those questions because a lot of people who would not be uh, too literate or maybe have questions if they are making worlds, would it be easy to take my project over? How similar is it to what I already know? Is it easy enough to convert over? Just, I want to ask some of those questions that those who would have that would also have those answers. That's all. I didn't mean to put you on the spot or anything as well with that.
No, it's all good.
Oh,
This is what I think about and talk about all day, so it's very hard to throw a curveball.
okay. I do have another question is what were some of the biggest hurdles in building your own engine like this and how did you overcome them?
So I would honestly say the biggest hurdle is just finding enough time to do it.
Mm,
Because obviously, like at this point, it doesn't generate like all my socials and whatnot. They don't quite generate enough money for me to sustain myself.
mm.
So I still have to work at other places, or have had to work at other places to still find the time to be able to work on this, and just not actually starve. But more recently, I have had luck with getting small amounts of investment and a good amount of community funding recently. And also, I've taken a job at a studio very, very recently that is very, very closely aligned with the goals of Brain Engine. That will help more than hamper the development in the future. So that problem is mostly solved at this point.
Oh, wow.
And then aside from that, the other problem is also still time. Like how much more time I have to I have to work on this to actually get it to a point where it's actually usable. So it's literally all time. The really easy way to solve that would be to be able to clone myself. If I had 10 of myself, I would get this done a lot faster.
Yeah, I'm very sure you would. So when you have you ever tried explaining what your project to those who you wish to invest in? How do they respond to like your project and your dreams with it? Hello, I'm actually here to interrupt the episode you're watching really quick to ask you a favor. Please come join us at any of the other locations we have. You can find us on YouTube and Spotify, both of which we post our episodes and are very up to date on both. We have Discord where you go to hang out all the time, where you're gaming and shooting the breeze over with many people over that way. Feel free to come join us. I invite you. If you wish to support us, we have a Patreon where we post a bunch of random bits, bobs, and extra podcasts every once in a while for you to go enjoy. Also, if you wish to support us while in Vrchat, we're now part of the creator economy. So please come join if you wish to support us there. It's there for you to choose if you so wish. And thank you very much. And a special thanks to some of the people who have signed up on our Patreon, which are as follows. And I have written down so I'll remember. And that's a tough thing. Forbidden Zero, Niche, Aliquum, Future Oracle, Lesser Capybara, and Frozen. Thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of the episode.
So generally, investors find it very interesting. I have talked to a couple about it. I do have one investor who is currently very, very lightly funding the project until it gets into a place where more concrete investment is makes more sense. Like he wants to see there actually be something like you'll be able to actually use it before he like fully jumps in. But then from other investors, it's kind of more the same, where game engines are a very hard, like hard tech, or as investors like to call it, deep tech problem, where it requires a lot of upfront investment, especially in time, but also in money if you're hiring a team. So generally they're a lot more cautious about it than they would be about other projects, just because it's quite a gamble, and it's a substantial one at that.
Hmm. Okay. So I have another question in terms of that. When you are going forward with Brane, do you intend it to be a game engine like Unity, or do you intend it to be a platform?
Um, Less of either. I imagine it more as I guess more as closer to like a web browser, but also the tools for publishing to it. But like the VR version of that. So a common set of tools that um, will eventually branch out into to multiple different platforms and forks. And of course, like the idea is to hopefully allow people to own what they build, but then also not have that break apart the community experience, because that's a big thing for me is whenever like a new platform comes out, it by necessity needs to break up the existing existing community of VRChat, not VRChat, but any platform's users. Like it needs to take users from another platform. So my hope is with this that is a common set of tools that allows people to create their own platforms, but then have those platforms not be disconnected from each other, in a sense.
Mm. So if people are willing to play a ball with you, would you and technically be able to thread different platforms together at all, or do you not intend on doing that at all?
So at the moment, I don't plan on really playing ball with other platforms outside of there is one framework, not platform, called Basis. And if you get a chance, you should talk to their developers as well because they're cool.
Okay.
Um, but they're working on a much more shorter term solution to like the save VR message.
Mm.
They're working on a Unity package or framework. It is a framework where you're able to take that and you essentially get the features of VRChat, um, but for your own platform that you own. So very similar like end goal to mine, but like much more shorter term. It's available right now. Like people can go and play around with it. It's still very much in the early buggy stages. But their goal is explicitly like if VRChat blows up in the next 6 months due to lack of funding, which is a more real possibility than people think it is. They're there to help the community like find somewhere to go. Whereas my project is like, here's my like worrying less about the actual practicality of things. Like let's build the coolest thing possible and worry about how to make it possible later.
Okay. I very much understand that. And with all of this you're building from your previous projects you worked on prior to Brane, did some of that knowledge transfer with you into what you're working on now?
Oh yeah, a ton. The obviously I've worked at companies that ooh, my desk thing just fell on my lap. Okay. Uh, I've worked at other companies that interfaced heavily with a large portion of the VRChat community, or not VRChat. I keep saying VRChat community when I just mean community. The VR community. Chat just sneaks in there. Interfaced with large portions of the VR community, and that has like at least I would say gotten me in tune with like the wants and needs of like the harder core users of VR, and then working on a web technology based engine that gave me an idea of like the idea of dynamically loading stuff. Even though I was already like had ideas for that, that's like okay, let's see this in a production environment and what the current technological stack looks like today and how I can improve on that. And then at my last company, I spent a lot of time building network backends. So CyberHub currently has a like Photon Fusion slash Normcore competitor, which is like a networking solution for Unity projects. Um, so that's like the portion where like two people are in a scene. How do they see each other over the network? But building out that entirely from scratch and also the database portion of that. I retain all of that knowledge, and of course, I'm going to build it differently for Brane
Hmm.
in a number of different ways. So it's not like I'm just copying what I did there. But it's like it's a wide breadth of like different things that all are very relevant to what I'm doing here.
Okay. And you said something that interested me, but I want a little bit of a clarification on. You said a way to dynamically load things. How is that different from what people are normally used to with current platforms and technology?
Um, I guess with the example of most modern games, dynamic loading, let's say for the in the instance of Unreal, a lot of Unreal games are now open world. So as you move from one area of the world to the next one, it dynamically loads portions of the world.
Mm.
So they aren't active in those portions of the world are on your hard drive. They're not on your RAM or in your graphics card, which are the faster portions of your memory. They're actually like it needs to be in there for your computer to actually show them on screen. So the dynamic loading, as opposed to, I guess, static loading. Static loading would be we just load your entire game into memory and then run with it, or an entire level. Whereas dynamic loading is, according to the needs of this play session, it is able to more granularly or piece by piece do that. And that's playing a much larger role in games that you just have downloaded to just on your computer or console. But in the future, it's probably going to be even more so over the network as well. So I think Vrchat would count as a dynamically loaded game as well, because you don't have any of these worlds stored on your device. Once you go to them once, they do get cached locally for a little bit. But for the most part, you can think of it as like they don't live on your PC. You're downloading them from somewhere else, and that's the dynamic loading aspect.
Oh,
And my engine is a much more like granular extension of that, taking that to its like most extreme version.
ah, okay. So what would it take to run Brane? Like, what would you imagine it would take to run Brane in terms of like hardware? What kind of setup or PC or headset would you need to run something like that smoothly? You would imagine anyway.
Um, well, yeah, imagination is like the important part here. The real answer is whatever I optimize it down to support. So I guess what's more important here is like what am I targeting? And for the current VR landscape, I think that I would target as the like lowest common denomination of hardware, it would be the Quest 2.
Hmm.
Um, so I definitely want to have standalone Android-based headset support. So that's like your Quest 2s, your Picos. I'm not super familiar with the Pico ecosystem, so choose like the Quest 2 equivalent of a Pico. And then obviously when Android XR comes out later this year or next year, I would want it working on there as well. And obviously if it can run on an Android headset, it can probably run on like medium specs of a PC as well.
Okay. So I do have a bit of a question as well for like the user base because I'm curious on the back end for running an engine as for like for someone like yourself, what do you need to do in order to have an engine run on different headsets properly? I don't know myself, that's why I ask.
Yeah. So for the most part, in a lot of cases, all of your code is not platform dependent, and it's only at the points at which your code like touches the operating system or the actual host's code. And a lot of times you can abstract that away by using cross-platform libraries. Like there's a library called GLFW, which abstracts away the actual window manager. And then APIs like Vulkan can work, which is for graphics, can work on most platforms. So I would call the Vulkan graphics API to interface with the GPU to, with hardware acceleration, generate all of the like graphics I need to, and then I would pass that over, in the case of desktop, to GLFW to display that on a window. But then when you get into the cases of like, what if it's not a desktop window? What if this is on a headset where running standalone on a headset where there is no windowing manager? Then you get into okay, what's a more cross-platform way to be able to display those pixels there? And then you look at like OpenXR, which is an open source standard for all headsets to be able to run the same hardware or software. So then that would be how you would get those pixels on screen, is you would call the OpenXR API bindings to then get that data onto both PC and standalone headsets. It gets a little bit harder when you talk about like maybe networking specific things, where sometimes you want to get a little bit closer to the metal. But just in general, you either try to use libraries that already handle it for you, or you have to go into your build system, and a lot of times they give you flags to say, if I'm compiling on this platform, only compile and link these libraries with those platform specific code, or even in your code you can do what are called compile definitions, where it enables this section of code for this platform and disables it for all other platforms. So there's a variety of different tools, and you kind of have to use the tools that are specific for the specific problem
Oh wow.
and platform. Yeah,
Sounds like
it's a
this
fun problem to solve.
sounds like a lot of work, to be honest with you. Did you anticipate all this when starting and getting into it? The different headsets, different codes, and having to
Um,
play with multiple series of things.
I don't want to like flat out say yes, so I'm gonna say like I was ready for there to be a lot of work, I shall say.
I can imagine building something like a game engine from ground up doesn't sound like an easy thing. What drives you, Mask?
um Honestly, I just find it really fun. Like that's the most honest answer. Like I enjoy solving problems more than I do even like playing video games. Like this is my equivalent of playing a video game for 12 hours a day, is coding for 12 hours a day.
Oh, so what got you into coding then?
Um I would say it's probably that my dad also works in like IT or coding, so it's kind of like young me looking at him coding, like saying, "Hey, can I do that too?" And then he sets up like a environment for me to like try out like HTML, and he got me a HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for Dummies book, and I used to just copy it out of that onto the screen. And it's kind of always been like a I want to build my own world sort of thing, and coding is the way to do that. And somewhere along the way, I just fell in love with the process.
Okay. What were some of your earliest projects you remember like, and how did your skill and ability develop over the course of your life?
Um, I guess one of the earliest projects I can remember is a website I made for so I was homeschooled growing up, and there's like a homeschool group that I would go to pretty often. So that's like where me and all of my other weirdo homeschooled friends would meet up at the park, or rather, our parents would bring us there because I was like younger than 10. Um, and I like made a website for like the Nerf club or Nerf battles. And like my dad let me put it on like a domain he wasn't using for anything.
Hmm.
Um, so there's like the Hat Nerf Club, which very much like Y2K colors that didn't match at all. Very much not very well artistically designed. Um, very little formatting, but it was pretty cool. It was pretty cool. And from there, it's kind of like JavaScript applications on like just Khan Academy, making small games and whatnot. And then I think my skills like really picked up when I switched to Unity, and then tried mostly it was me trying to copy Boneworks. I was very much inspired by the physics systems of Boneworks, and the majority of my knowledge just came from like hammering against like Unity, trying trying to recreate that. And then of course later I find out they used some like pre-existing libraries and messed around with them. It's not like entirely from scratch.
Okay.
But I'm like very grateful that like I didn't know that, because then I like actually tried to figure it out. And then like the true jump in my skills was actually when I started working on Brane Engine, or rather like the precursor projects, where I actually started working on scripting languages before I started working on the actual engine itself, or I'd even named it.
Hmm.
So like if you scroll through my GitHub, there's like a couple coding repositories under the name Thunderscript. So those are like my early attempts at making scripting languages. So like first I wrote an interpreter, and then I like JIT compiled it with like custom assembly commands, and like first it was my own parser, and then I learned how to use external parser lexers, and that's really how I learned like C++ and lower level languages, was just by using them. I'm like really bad at actually like sitting down and studying things, like chronically so. So my learning strategy has just been either like I just jump in, I try to do it, and then I teach somebody else how to do it on like my website or something, and that really solidifies the knowledge for me.
Okay. So how does one write their own language? I'm asking from as a simpleton standpoint. I have no idea how would one go about something like that.
Well, step one, you say, I want to make a coding language because that sounds cool. And then you look it up and you find like the two YouTubers that have actually explained how the process of making a coding language works. But essentially, it boils down to three different portions, and you can get it smaller than that. Like you can have it just be one thing, but generally it boils down to three different things you have to code. First thing you have to code is a parser slash lexer, and usually you use a tool for that. So that's when you go from text to what's called an abstract syntax tree, which is a fancy language for here's essentially a node graph in memory of all the operations that this language is doing. Like you would have a node that's like, here's an add operation, and one node is like one of the arguments, and the other node is another one of the arguments, like where that data is coming from. So it's just going from text to something your computer can understand. And then you take that, and what I like to do is compile that down into a bit code. So you go and basically serialize it down into like you have like a command here, and these are the arguments to this command. Like this is an add operation, and it takes variables a and b. And I like doing that because then after that point you can write an interpreter and have like a giant switch statement in that interpreter where you go, if this operation, go to this point in the code and do that operation, and then take this operation and then do that operation, and just make either an uh, yeah, at that point you can make an interpreter which does that, or you can go the extra step and then throw that into a backend like LLVM or crane lift or a custom one, and that actually compiles fully down to machine code. And for if you're going like the LLVM route, you don't necessarily have to do the bit code in between. That's kind of specific to my case where I might need to send the bit code over the network. So I guess the smallest version of that you can build is write a parser from scratch and make the parser the actual thing that does operations. So like if you see 2 plus 2 in your text, just write there, do the addition as you read it, instead of kind of splitting that up. But I would say first try to go for like the 3-step of like text to something your computer can understand, something your computer can understand to something a interpreter can understand, and then you write that interpreter. And of course you don't write them one by one, you write them all at once.
Okay.
But yeah.
Oh, well, thank you for explaining that. And do you have any favorite coding languages and non-favorite coding language? Why? Because I only ask because
Ooh.
their business. I remember some friends of mine here in Vrchat who coders were complaining about a language they wanted to learn for fun, which was Rust. And I just wanted to ask you what have been your favorites and non-favorites.
Yeah, so speaking of Rust would be one of my favorites. I'm like, since I spent so much time writing my own language, like the version 1 of Brane script, I got all the way to the point of like having compile time code execution, which means like the compiler is writing code before it even gets executed for optimization purposes, and like templates, which is a way of writing generic functions that can accept multiple different types. So like I was that far down into like making my own language, and then I discovered Rust, And a lot of my language had taken inspirations from the way that C++ worked,
Mm,
especially like what are called move semantics, which is what happens when objects are created and destroyed and also moved around. And those are a lot cleaner in Rust than they are in other languages. And also, the error checking in Rust is just amazing as well. Just the um, less so, I guess, the language itself, but like the common culture of the language of how to handle those things.
mm.
Whereas like C++ is lacking a lot of like that common culture aspect. Because C++ is also kind of like a mud ball of it's been around for so long and there wasn't as much thought put into its specifications and how it works. And then to the less favorite languages, I have mad beef with JavaScript. Like it's it's where I started out, but it it's still to this day in a more unintuitive language for me to use. I much prefer statically typed over dynamically typed languages, where dynamically typed languages is this variable can be any value. I can put a text value into here, I can put an integer value into here. There's not really anything stopping me from just treating this variable like whatever I want. And that leads there to be a lot of errors that happen when the program is actually running, to stuff that I think should be caught by the compiler before the code is even run. And that's what statically typed languages do. I say, I want this to be a floating point variable, which is a number that can have decimal points, and I always want it to be that and nothing else. And for this function, I want to accept that type. And now I don't have to worry about like what I'm actually going to pass into this function, because when I try to click compile, the compiler will tell me, "Hey, you didn't follow what you thought you were going to do. Like you didn't follow your own rules. Now go fix that." And then it instead of having to do like this loop of running the program, clicking a button, and then like going through the steps that I would need to do to trigger that code while the program's running, to like repeatedly to try to figure out what that error is. Instead, I click the make program button and then it says, "Hey, there are problems in this program you should fix before making the program." So
Mm.
basically, I like have general avoidance of any language that is dynamically typed. So that's like JavaScript, Python, etc. I do use Python for like utility scripts.
Mm.
Like you'll even find some Python scripts in the Brane engine codebase that I'm using to just do simple like uh, automatic code generation things, or I even have a script called bragging stats near the root directory of the project that I can click and it will tell me how many lines of code are in the project and other fun statistics like that. Um, so I like it as like a cross-platform shell scripting thing, but it's not for like anything larger than that. Like once it gets out to 2 Python files, that's too big of a Python project.
Mm. The sounds of this sounds like a lot of lines of code you're writing for the engine. How do you stay organized? Ask with all of this.
It comes down to the mostly the way that I structure the file directories, where it's uh, like the code is generally where you would expect it to be. Like, I need to edit the code for the asset browser widget on the editor. Where would that be? I would go to source editor, and then it would be under, I believe I have widgets as its own folder, and then it would be in that folder. So I kind of followed like a logical path with all of my where I put everything. Like I put a lot of effort into naming things in such a way that it theoretically doesn't need documentation. Like the idea of self-documenting code, partially because a lot of times I'm too lazy to write actual documentation. So that's kind of like my cop out of why. But also, it is kind of very much nice to be able to understand what code is from just looking at it, but also like understanding where stuff should be from the general file structure.
Okay. So, what do you imagine the future of Brain would be like when everything is said and finished, everything is coded in the final version before posting would be? What do you imagine it would look like?
Um, I would imagine I don't imagine there being a final version. I imagine it always being a work in progress of
Mm.
sorts. Um, but the version of it that I see being like the the version that's like finally usable, where like I post, it is now ready, like everybody go wild. We turn off the beta marker on it, like V1 has released. That's probably similar to Vrchat in a lot of ways,
Mm.
or potentially also might look like Resonate if I go like the in-app editing route. Um, and then like long term future is just watch Ready Player One.
Ah. So you intend on having like interconnectable worlds or with less loading screens kind of thing, or do you intend on having loading screens?
Oh, like half of the entire reason I'm making the project is no loading screens. Like that is a
Okay.
day one goal. Where through combination of a few different things, you would be able to make just completely remove it. So one is the dynamic chunk loading system,
Mm.
where I have this portion of the world and this portion of the world, and each one can exist independently. I can unload this one so it doesn't exist, but this one's still here and you're inside of it, and then I can reload it back in and it doesn't really affect you. So with that chunk loading system, if you add in a couple more features to that, like the possibility for at runtime you to change which chunk is relative to this one, like I would say instead of this chunk being there, let's put this other chunk here from a different server there. Now this chunk is connected to a different world. If you're able to do that, suddenly that allows you to make, say, like hub worlds. You could almost imagine like a TARDIS where um, a user has like a TARDIS world as like their home. So you would connect this TARDIS to the chunk that you want to go to, and then be able to walk out of the doors after it's loaded. And another feature of that that is probably required is like portal style portals,
Mm.
where you're able to, look through that and see the world on the other side. But those two sections of the world aren't actually connected, so you'd essentially be able to do like completely disconnected chunks that are connected through that portal system. So if you did like an overhead view of the world, or maybe like render layers, like they'd either be overlapping or somewhere like completely different, but there would be like that connecting point where players can walk through to other chunks. It's kind of like a connection of chunks are able to reassign what they're relative to. There's a native portal mechanic in the engine that allows you to walk between those. And then the third one that's might lend itself to like more of a vehicle type system is the ability for the offset between chunks to be dynamic. So now I would be able to have chunks that aren't like a piece of terrain that's a part of a world. Now I can have a chunk that's like, this is my custom spaceship I fly around to worlds. And here's like a custom spaceport API that this world has implemented where it can register to some index that like, hey, I'm part of like the spaceport network. And I have like a connection to that on this spaceship chunk, and that's able to load me into that world, and I'm able to like land there after dynamically loading. That would be a very extensive system that I've only like thought about from the conceptual level, but it's
Mm.
built upon the basic like change links, change the offset of links, and then that portal system.
Okay. So it'd be more like very advanced Lego bricks putting together versus like click door, load screen, walk in. It'd be like you look this direction, load Lego brick, add Lego brick, you walk through, done kind of thing.
Exactly. The like main inspiration for all of this was I used to have like really slow Wi-Fi, like living out in the middle of nowhere in a midwestern state. And like by slow Wi-Fi, I don't mean like 30 megabits down. I mean like 8. So like when I was going around, like it was a high enough bandwidth for me to be in an instance with like a good number of people, but the instant I went to like load like a 50 megabyte world with say a group of people, they would all be able to jump to there immediately or relatively quickly. Like it probably was only 10 or ish seconds of downloading, or maybe even up to 20. But for me, it was like 5 minutes where I'm just sitting here in the void and there's like, I'm just like, well, I hope they haven't walked away from spawn so I can actually find them in this massive world that I'm downloading. So that's kind of what spawned the idea of like my train between worlds or like these dynamically reassigned hub worlds is that it would allow groups to not break up because
Hmm.
if you imagine walking around in a group with a group of friends, you probably wouldn't be too annoyed by that one friend with like the slower internet connection as long as you're able to still be having a conversation and interacting with each other. So like my initial idea is like a subway between worlds to where like a world would place like a subway door in their world and that would connect to a larger network of these subway doors. And then when you wanted to go around and explore, you'd like summon the train, it would open, and you'd be able to jump around to different instances and actually like like pick up a friend group where like you go to the instant that this friend is in, the doors open and they're able to get into the train with you, and then it's like very easy to manage how long it takes for you to load things because you just go, oh, the doors don't open until everybody has loaded the minimum amount of content required for what's outside the door, and that completely solves, at least conceptually, the idea of like breaking up the group, which happens a lot in modern VR platforms.
Hmm.
And like the entire point of this is like hanging out with people. So let's just make that. Let's never break the immersion.
Okay. So another question I have is how large would one of those Lego bricks be for like at least in game size anyway? For like distance? Like would it be like a 5 by 5 square? Would it be a certain amount of meters or miles you'd expect before you'd have to load a new zone?
Um, for the most part, I'm gonna leave that up to world creators. I imagine it having a very low poly polygon as the boundary. So a set of 3D points, like a 3D mesh that is like the shell of this chunk, and then of course like going over that boundary would be transitioning to other chunks that match up with that boundary. So I don't think I would actually limit the size or smallness of that to any extent, but I would say like probably keep it under the floating point limit.
Okay.
Um, because the way that positions will work in the engine is that the center point of the chunk is the center point for all of the assets within the chunk for loading and whatnot. And then when you move to another chunk, your position is now relative to that chunk. So if you have a world larger than the floating point precision limit, that doesn't really matter because as you're moving from chunk to chunk, the offset is relative to that rather than like a world global like zero coordinate. Um,
Okay. So from my understanding, you could in essence build some like massive city and then break it up into smaller chunks within Brain Engine. So as you have like California mapped out, and just as long as it's broken down into smaller bite-sized pieces along the way, it could essentially exist.
pretty much, yeah.
Oh wow, that sounds
As long as you have the server space for it.
so the limit then would be server size then.
Yep. The ability for the creator to actually host that much data and also with good enough servers, like I assume if you have like an entire replica of California and some interesting gameplay, you're probably having a fair amount of users, so you need to have the actual backend just like raw power to be able to support that.
Hmm. I, I was using that as a necessary example. It's an extreme example because California is massive, but yeah, in essence.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It
Okay.
definitely would be like you'd probably run into some bugs. If you do plan on doing that, let me know.
I have no intent of doing that. Me and game engines don't work out too well, so don't worry. I look at Unity and my computer blue screens.
I've done that once or twice. Yep.
Yep, I don't know how it did. Turn it on, like let's load in my project, and then blue screen, fun lines. Like okay, cool. I guess I'm done. Not doing this again.
Yep. I've had it once where like I was testing out some physics mechanics and like I must have done something really wrong because my character flew off into nowhere and then my computer blue screened.
Ooh. Oh, did
That's
you?
happened more than once, I want to say.
Oh, did you run into any problems like that while making Brane?
Um, I have had one instance where something happened with the editor where it like was paused to the point where like not even task manager or admin command line stuff could shut it down. Aside from that, I don't think I blue screened my computer with it yet, though I expect to in the future.
Oh, okay. So I'm gonna ask a question that I think Raptor would not forgive me from asking if I was. So I'm gonna generalize it to VR in general. But what is the weirdest thing within VR have you seen?
Oh man. Um, I don't know. I've seen a lot. Hmm. I don't know. I'm gonna use it as an excuse to say one of the coolest things I've seen. I've
Okay.
seen like the entirety of the Half-Life 1 train entrance as an avatar. So it's like the
Oh wow.
Half-Life 1 tram, and you go inside, and it like goes through the entire tram,
Oh wow.
um, like experience of the start of that game.
Oh wow. I have seen an avatar. It's a really neat avatar. Being able to. Have you been into City 17 yet?
Um, Potentially. I mean, I've played Half-Life Alyx, but not. I don't think I've done it in VR chat.
Someone has built City 17 in VR chat as a entirely visitable place. If that interests you.
Nice. I will have to check that out.
Oh, well, this is over. I'll drop a portal. You can copy and see it in your own time if you'd like.
Nice.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna ask a few more questions before we start wrapping this up. First of which is the name used in VR chat. Where did you get it? Why do you use it? Why do you still use it?
Well, it's WireWhiz. I'm very consistent with my branding everywhere. You can essentially find me as WireWhiz or the WireWhiz on every single platform out there. And the reason I originally chose it was because of that website I started when I was 14, which was teaching electronics tutorials. So that's why it's a circuit board. That's why it's wire. Um, Wiz is kind of like that's meant to mean like wizard. I know that's not exactly how you spell wizard, but I thought the four letters looked nicer. And I mean like it. I feel like it fits me. I've had it for long enough that it's like I'll respond to it faster than my own name sometimes.
Oh wow. And the avatar you have and use, where do you get it? Why do you use it? Is there anything about it that means anything to you?
I guess it's like it's a custom retexture I did of the Spiral Volley avatar, I believe. And like the reason I wear mainly a Volley avatars is because I found a Tron themed a Volley retexture like a while back, or a hot minute ago, or very far back. And I just really liked it. And then like I just started doing like a volley retextures, and eventually I'll make this one look more Tron-esque. Like my last one was a lot more cyberpunk-esque or Tron-y. And that's the plan for this one too. But this one currently in its current form was like a one day very fast retexture before a shelter opened up. So
Oh wow.
yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing and thank you for coming on. Let us get to know you and your project. It's an absolute honor. Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course. And thank you for having me on.
Oh, where can the audience find you or your projects if they wish to reach out?
So if you go to my YouTube channel, they very well displayed like my plan to save VR video. Underneath there is links to my Discord as well as basically of any other platform. Generally, if you search WireWhiz, you'll find me everywhere.
Oh, well, thank you very much, and I'll make sure that links as well as everything else to your socials will be right down below for the people to find. If you're in YouTube, it's in. If you go down description, hit show more. There's a section we have labeled guest links. Will be in there. If you're on Spotify, it'll be up on the episode description. Same place, same label, easy to find. So with that said, this really we kind of gauge you down a little bit. So I'll ask you a question. What's sometime you, the audience, have broke something involving technology? Like the example I gave earlier, where I looked at Unity and I blue screened my computer. I'd like to hear yours. With that said, thank you very much for joining us. We'll see you out Metaverse somewhere. Have a good day. Oh boy.
I was an adventurer once till I took an arrow to the knee. Owie. It hurts so bad. Mom! Mom, I took an arrow to the knee! I was an adventurer! What happened, Mom? Damn, Mom's not home. Mom's not home! I forgot the key, and there's no mat to put it under. Maybe it's under here. Maybe she put it under the... melted the bitch in the fire. Well, that hurts. God, I'm a loner. Ventura is my situation when you take an arrow to the knee. But too bad it didn't hit me in between the toes. But it made me loopy, though. Are you a... oh, God. Oh, wow. I know. I'm not even at the right house. That's why.